UVM, the Media Project.
Hey, listen, it's a hearty good morning, which is unusual for us here at the Are We Here Yet podcast. As always, your host, Scott M. Graves. I'm really happy to be here. And for once, I'm hyped up on coffee as opposed to cocktails, because we usually do this in the evening. But that's also not true. I don't drink to do this podcast. This is another in our series known as Innova802. And I am joined this morning by my co-hosts for the Innova802 Rural Tech series. I of course, am talking about the wonderful two gentlemen in the other two parts of this wonderful state of Vermont, Ryan Munn and Will Jeffries. How you doing, gents?
Doing well, thanks.
Listen and accounted. It's an excellent morning in September.
And we have a great guest we're going to launch into here in just a moment. And I'm going to let our co-host, Will Jeffries, introduce our friend. And today we're talking about open source remedies, open source solutions, and how in a rural tech sector we are utilizing open source solutions for a better tomorrow. Will Jeffries, take it away.
That's right, Scott. And thank you. So anyone who's listened to earlier episodes of this podcast has probably noticed that a couple of topics that have come up over and over again in our conversations, some of those being, how are we collaborating together on solutions in this new world, in this tech-enabled world? Another is the distribution of ownerships. Ryan, a couple of episodes back, had brought several really interesting topics on the idea of how blockchain or other systems can be used to distribute the ownership and the work of caring for systems, developing new solutions and remedies, as Scott was saying. And every time I feel like my mind has gone to open source. And so my local expert for open source, a friend of mine that I've known since my work at UVM, Kendall Fortney, who currently runs the VERSO program at UVM with a focus on developing and piloting open source projects between the university with students and outside organizations. So anytime that a question about open source has come up, or since my earliest conversations with Kendall, I keep seeing over and over in the world the connections back to this idea. So I'm so excited to finally bring Kendall onto this podcast. So welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Kendall, start off maybe by telling us, I find it interesting that the university, and this is in recent time, decided to get involved in various open source solutions. Is the organization that you are now program director of sort of an intake for a variety of open source solutions, right? So it becomes sort of a clearinghouse or the center of an open source universe for rural tech? Or is it opposite? Is it, that there's already a lot of open source solutions that are being produced on campus and this is the way to get it out into the world?
I feel like it was just one of those. I had a lot more free time. The answer is it's all of that. Like, we do a variety of roles inside of UVM. The office, the Vermont Research Open Source Program Office is what VERSO stands for, has been around for almost 2.5 years now, which is just kind of crazy. So it's still a fairly new thing in this timeline of academic offices, but we do both internal and external work. We work with faculty, researchers, staff on open source projects they may be working on, or completing. We do advocacy inside of the university to support that. So policies, infrastructure, building repositories, adding things that help them. Like, we're going to be doing an open science thing to teach faculty about NASA's open science program. There's a variety of internal things that we do. We also developed a program called ORCA, which is the Open Research Community Accelerator, which is focused on building things, because we all work a lot, and people that are doing research often don't have a lot of time to do all the things that are required for open, because openness is expensive. It takes time, it takes effort, and it's harder often to get compensation for that, because that nature of that work is it's kind of expected. So we've been adding students and student internship teams to actually develop things. And the requirements of those that they need to be externally focused. Like we've done software projects for researchers around tools that only exist as .exes. No one even has the source code anymore. So rebuilding that with partners that are outside of UVM, or more interesting, we've been doing some stuff on data, working with the state of Vermont and other regional partners on building data sets that haven't existed, trying to answer problems around the state. And it keeps on growing, like finding ways to connect with businesses and how they approach open source as a business model. I talked to someone fairly early on that kind of asked me the question of like, what is an open source business model? And that threw me for a loop and kind of put me into this wild chase that ended up with me talking to Will a lot about this, as we've kind of been working through some of these questions ourselves to figure out like how these things connect. Like there's a lot of different pieces where business, innovation, and open source interact and do some amazing things. And for me personally, like my background is fine arts. I started working in tech startups when I moved to Vermont 14 years ago because I wanted to make some money because art doesn't pay great. And at a certain point, about halfway through that, I left my job and went to open source, learned Python, and changed my career path into data science and data analysis and product management. And I think like that's the other aspect of this, is what open source can provide as opportunities for exploration, education, things that you can't get any other way.
Yeah, there's a rogueness. There's a rogue culture behind open source that is very cool, and not unexpectedly, there's a lot of people from the fine and performing arts that end up gravitating towards, you know what I mean? So it's like
100%, yeah.
It's a great place for all of us that, I come from a musical background. So, like if you know, computer science people that we had in our department back in the day in college, everybody had some kind of open source thing going on. Because
it's funny
you have an opportunity to write code and you're doing something that nobody else is doing.
It's funny you say that too, right? Because you've mentioned jazz is very improvisational. There's a whole aspect of like there's a certain element of that is open, and there's a certain element of that is capitalized. And I like to kind of joke like the first open source might have been fire or the wheel, right? And then somebody eventually started farming or hunting with that tool and sort of capitalized on that for the benefit of their society. And so we do this leapfrog with open source and capitalization of ideas, open source capitalization ideas. But the key thing is we keep the open source, right? Because if we lose it, like to your point, those EXEs, we don't know how they work anymore. Like we need that openness to be able to continue evolving and not get caught, and so aside from open source, this is a very relevant conversation today with technology evolving. And you could take that question of like, where's the business model for open? Like, we really need to ask ourselves, where's the human business model for technology? Because if technology is going to do all the work that we think of as work today, we have to rethink where the value is created. And I think this really falls right into that synergistic conversation about how do you create a value model with open source? What open source is forcing you to do is find the value, and the value's in people. And on the other side of it, we have a commercial pushing tech going, hey, how do we make this humane? Well, it's finding the value in people, in my opinion. And so I'm curious how that dialogue is ongoing in your realm, in your environment, and how that's being explored.
It's fascinating because I've spent a lot of time working in companies and corporate culture and understanding how that worked. And as a product manager, understanding like, hey, this is how we do business. And it was really valuable. And I bring a lot of that into UVM when I'm doing these questions about like, what are you trying to build and that kind of thing. The thing that's distinctly different about openness, it's a method, not an end. And that method is how do we distribute and open up conversations about choices we're making? Because like open source is about governance more than anything else, is like who can use it and how do we make choices about where it goes. And in companies, we often make those choices behind closed doors. Because we're competing with others around it. And there are many places that is appropriate. Like openness is not the solution to all things, but the things that are really impactful to our society, like those questions should be open. The hard part of that is that's messy. It is confusing. It is ugly. It requires the brain and emotional capacity to have those conversations. And like as someone that has used open source and I'm learning how to run open source, like it is a steep learning curve and it is a useful learning curve. We start thinking about these things. Like all the work we've done with the data stuff, working with all these different partners, the question I'm now trying to understand is like, how do we develop the infrastructure to talk about governance and start building roadmaps for what we want to build collectively that all of us share the responsibility for what happens and we all get a voice in it. And yet we're still able to do things, because there's a version of that where you just don't ever get anything done. I've been in those places, right? Like we all have had that. So how do we actually have that be focused on a mission that advances the thing we're trying to do, but allows us all to have a voice, and we all are able to put in the pieces that we need to put in to make something happen? And this experiment, like this has happened in a variety of ways all the place. None of them are exactly the same because people are different every place. It's like, yeah, it's not going to be one-to-one, but it's an interesting place to have those conversations and thinking about talking.
Your comment about EXEs brought up something in my mind from the past, and that is, and so I want to focus on the data side of this for a moment, continue to do so, which is with a colleague, Steve Manaver, about a decade ago, we were consulting various parties at Harvard Medical School, but the subject of the size of the problem and the problem itself being that assays, when you get down to the assay level in medical research, some high percentage of the current research being done at the assay level has already been done. It might have even already been done 10 times already over the last 130 to 150 years, because there is no aggregated central place within any individual research facility, individual university, or other academic institution, or the world, right? Where we know, hey, is the very detailed level, is the assay that we're working on right now, has this already been done before?
So actually, I'll have to give you a slight correction there.
Okay.
There is a company that started in my region here. I won't name any company names for this episode for the moment, but there's a company that started doing 3D imaging years ago for doctors to help them plan their make their surgical plans, right? They were then aggregating data across a few institutions that they were supporting. They started creating different ways of accessing that data for research. A few years later, it became noticed how many more publications this group of doctors were producing. That database has now spun out into a separate company that now serves hundreds of institutions. They might have a focus. I forget if it's cardiac or something, but to your point, they are able to, because they're getting that collaboration, because they've created sort of an open protocol for that data sharing and research, that group, everyone involved in that network, keeps expanding and keeps producing exponentially more research products.
Well, see, and in 2007, 2008, 2009, which is the time period I'm talking about, that did not exist.
Right. It didn't. It was just happening, to your point, behind closed doors.
You and emerging communities then. And just a quick note too on a technical piece, medical assay. Scott, do you want to give us a quick overview of that for our listeners?
So I am not a doctor, nor do I pretend to be one here on the podcast. But to my knowledge, at the assay level, we're talking about very small, sort of encapsulated pieces of research and the resulting, the results of that experiment or small series of experiments. An assay is brought together with a whole series of assays, and that becomes a full body of research. So at the assay level, it's, and we're talking about things that are very...
So as the example that I used, instead of just looking at one surgery, they can look at 100 surgeries that all have the same goal of moving this aortic valve or adjusting this thing. And they can look at this one cut here, this one cut here, this one cut here, and look at the results. And that provides very significant, research data.
Or if, like, conversely, if you're working on a pharmaceutical and, you'll have this long chain of chemistry, right? One assay is looking at a particular part of it. Another assay could be looking at a particular part of it, et cetera. So that's how I've come to understand it. And I might be wrong. So somebody listening in biotech after this might say, that guy doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. But just look at the underlying principles of what we're saying.
Hey, so since we're on definitions, though, we did get a little bit ahead of a little assumption. Open source, we talk a lot about it. There's actually different flavors of open source. There's open source licensing. Can you elaborate a little bit, Kendall, on just like what is open source to someone who kind of like knows, thinks they know what it is, or maybe someone's just really questioning like what is this thing, and why is it so important, and why is this VERSO happening?
So is this podcast 4 hours or 5.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you didn't just 90 seconds if you could. We want to plant the seed, let it grow from there.
At a core level, open source is about building, creating, sharing, and managing resources together. Resources can be software, they can be data, they can be process, they can be a lot of different things. Open source is really kind of usually is referred to as a software equation of like, hey, I publish my code openly with a license, so permissions to use it openly. The licenses is a key component of open source. If you don't have a license with it, usually people are like, it's really open. If no one understands what they can do with it,
right,
it doesn't matter. So licenses will either sit there and say, hey, you can use it for whatever you want, commercial or not. There are licenses that will say, those are called permissive, so they allow you to use it the way you would want. Or there are licenses that are called copyleft, which is like basically saying, hey, if you use my stuff, this open source stuff that I made, you also have to make your stuff open. So there's versions where like, hey, I can take your stuff and I can make it closed. And there's versions where I have to also keep it open as I do that. Working in companies, usually you try to avoid those left-leaning licenses because it makes ownership really complicated of your software. But all of them usually require you to have a copyright of the original work in there somewhere. Like in academia is also the open science piece of this. So that's like, we talk a lot about software, but we also do a lot with data. We do with publications. So a lot of scientific journals are closed. You have to pay to subscribe to them. And they're increasingly becoming more open because partially mandates from the federal government to force the ecosystem that way. If you want to go into a deep dive, look at like publishing of academic journals and like their crazy business model and how much money they make is just its own fascinating collection of like incentives and structures. And they're trying to figure out how to do this too. So effectively the federal government said, hey, if you're getting federal money from us, your stuff has to be open, unless there's a security or a privacy reason that it can't be. And in the academic spaces, we've been trying to figure out how to actually do that. I think, the National Science Foundation and, like those kind of groups are also trying to figure out like how exactly we do this well. So we're all kind of figuring out together. It's not like a clean path of how we actually make this stuff available and how we make it clear who can use it for what. To your question and your comments, Scott, like it's hard. Like there are a lot of different data repositories for different disciplines, and the nature of research it's like there's an element of research that's kind of like a free agent. Everyone is doing their work. They're getting funding for the stuff they're doing. Part of the goal of that funding is to create something new and innovative. Infrastructure is boring to grants. Building a single data repository and having all that stuff is really boring. It's a thing that, it takes time and the money needs to keep on going. That's not the way grants usually work. So building infrastructure is usually more about academic institutions making choices about like the Harvard Dataverse, an example of them building. I can't even imagine how much money they spend trying to deal with the amount of data they store, but building those kinds of things. And the reality is, because of the way this system works, there is no you have to do it this way in reality. It's more, how do we build crawlers that can find all this stuff and aggregate it in the ways we need to understand it? Because trying to enforce a one truth is just, I don't have enough hair left to turn gray to make that happen.
Gregory Thomas, the director of the Berthiaume Center for Entrepreneurship at UMass Amherst, and I did an interview just last week and talked a lot about how this challenge relates to the lack of IP transfer, or the challenge to IP transfer, right? Because people are so focused on, publish or perish that, and there's a disconnect between that and folks that really have no interest in seeing intellectual property to market, and the people who would bring it to market but don't have access to the information in a way, in a steady flow of information transfer between academia and the business world, where people can sort of cherry pick, I think we can take this intellectual property and make a business out of it, or maybe multiple businesses.
Well, to speak to a business model, maybe you could share a little insight on Android, right? Sponsored. Tom, can you elaborate a little bit on sort of like, where that sort of as a example that's going on in the world is really, we're all very dependent on, right? And how that maybe relates down to the nitty gritty of what you're working on at VERSO, so that we're not beholden, per se.
Those kind of business models, they're often in corporate open source. There's often a business need that it fulfills. Like there are projects that have kind of existed outside of that, like Apache, which runs most of our web services, right? Like that's infrastructure, and that can often exist. Like Linux, right, is an operating system that is open source that kind of exists outside of those spaces of inside a single corporate entity. They have foundations that support them because they need to have work done and they need to have people to organize and manage those things. Again, open source isn't free. And I think things like when you start exploring open source and businesses that are not I don't even know how big Google is, this billions-dollar corporations, like you're talking more about how you think about building community and developing a different, so like as a product manager, I care about user fit and I'm trying to like have an addressable market and those kinds of things. You're talking open source, you're trying to find like a community that supports the same interests as you because they are the people that are building your stuff as well as using it. And it's a different business perspective when you think about Android requires, hey, like we had this thing that is vital to make our, Google's stuff accessible and available to be able to use. But in reality, they also have to build that with the idea of others engaging with it and having that kind of shared governance about what happens with it. It is not clean. It is always messy. And it's also a key component. Like the same thing with research, like the incentives to do this, like to be open are starting to emerge more and more. Like UVM has adopted a strong stance of trying to advance open source. I am grateful for that. Otherwise my job would be a lot harder. And there's more and more OSPOs that are open source program offices, OSPOs that are happening in other academic institutions driven by grant funding to advance these missions. And we hope that by doing that, we also get the incentives. So like incentives in business, incentives in academia, get the incentives aligned to like, hey, this is important. We incentivize it. We reward it. This is something you should actually spend time on because you have a limited amount of time. Like we want to make that happen. I think that kind of helps.
Imagine a vibrant region that embraces innovative technology and systems, allowing individuals and businesses to grow and thrive within the natural and cultural lifestyle of Vermont. Imagine the Black River Innovation Campus. Our community includes business and technology programming, co-working and technology tools, and other exciting experiences that are quickly creating an outsized impact to our little corner of northern New England here in Springfield, Vermont. PC Mag rates Springfield, Vermont number 8 for the best work-from-home cities in the U.S. Join us in Vermont. Begin your journey at bricvt.org.
Well, the exciting thing too, I guess, is in the credential space, right? Like in open source, any student or anybody can go figure out what's needed, make a contribution, and then point to their contribution. And so that's an interesting thing of openness around the world in terms of this knowledge base that's being built and how people can share and exchange those ideas. And it also speaks to, like you mentioned, you made a career pivot into sort of the developer data side of things. But now you're also speaking about kind of a third career that you described in terms of community engagement, right? That's that's communications, that's understanding different people, kind of where they're coming from and where they come together. And so that's one of the really interesting things that I find powerful for open source and open anything for the most part is that, any corporation that sees an opportunity is going to have a timeline. And to a certain extent, there's likely to be an expense of humanity in the process, even if it's, hey, I need you to work 12-hour days to get this out the door, right? That is an expense of the human value to meet that sort of commercial interest. And that may happen on the open source side too. They've got a community of contributors. They need to get that code up to snuff so they can commercialize the piece that they're selling. So there's that aspect in the corporate world. But on the other side of it, you have this very open community that people can be contributing to. There are evolving mechanisms of incentives even from organizations and such to help support this developer community. So, it speaks to the humanitarian aspect of this open technology developing with people really included, as opposed to this belief that technology companies seem to have sometimes that like their technology is what makes the value and the people are just, fodder.
Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never been in a company that does that whatsoever.
So I would love to hear a little bit more about that community piece of it that you're exploring and how, because it's more, there's other expertise too that comes into really making these ecosystems vibrant and successful. And I'm sure you're getting some insight about some of that from this experience.
I'll tease out a couple parts of that. So students working with me, like the pods I've been running, a lot of them initially look at it as professional development, because you're right. Like for me too, like I don't have a degree in mathematics. Like for me to get a work in this field, I had to demonstrate somehow that I could do the work. And doing open source allowed me to show, hey, I've done this stuff. You can see the work I've done. You can see that it works. You can run it yourself. You know it happens. Students that I'm working with now, when they go to apply for things and be like, hey, I contribute to a project, you can see it. You can see, because we also track all the tasks for them openly. You can see the work, literally the tasks that they had to complete. So like these aspects of openness are really valuable to demonstrate to someone else your credentials, your prestige, your like value. It's hard to be that open, and it also means exposing mistakes. And we have a lot of shame around mistakes, which is counterproductive to like actually succeeding. And I think one of the aspects of community building and open source that is, to your point, the second half of what you're talking about, like I worked at companies, I can't even imagine how much money building a new product line. And we went finally to go talk to the customer, and they're like, we don't want that. Like launch of the new thing, and they're like, we don't want it. And I think the thing that's interesting about open source is because you're developing it openly, people can see it as you do it. They see your roadmap, they see what you're building, and that feedback, as messy as that is real. Like it's fast, it's there. It's people are engaging with it as you're doing it. They're contributing. They're saying, hey, that's maybe a bad idea. The hard part of that is balancing, like what things you pay attention to. Like if you've been any sort of leadership, like where you say, no, we're just going to do this, and where we say, maybe you're right. And that's the hard part of this kind of work. And I think it's also the most rewarding, because you become a more whole person doing that kind of thing, where you start making those choices, understanding those responsibilities, understanding the payoffs, trade-offs, complexities of these decisions. And community development is not just saying, hey, thank you for your code, goodbye. It's like running events. So like part of the things that I do is I run community events. I need more time to do more of that, to be honest. Like it's something like part of it is recognizing and showing the work that we do to each other allows us to be like, hey, this is valuable work. And I value the input you're doing, and working on collaborating after 2 years in COVID where we just didn't do that. Like teaching these skills and practicing these skills of collaborating as equals. Like the students that I have are a variety of different disciplines, and they're like, they wouldn't have this exposure until they do this. And the practice of that is really valuable. And working on negotiating choices and being given the power to make choices around that, I think is really powerful. The ARC program at UVM is the commercial version of this that existed before I did my thing, that I looked at as like, that's really cool. I want to do this applied work, but in openness. Like those kinds of things where students figure this stuff out, I think is really important. And the community building is a deliberate design process. A lot of programming is not amazing at communication. So like bringing in different perspectives into this and thinking about how you listen and how you, it's really easy as someone that solves problems to be like, I know how to solve this problem. It's really hard to be like, oh, how do you want me to solve this problem? Is a different question. And that's hard for us to ask.
Or I solved the problem. How do I explain to you how to?
How it works.
So it's fair to say that you're a proponent of the humanization of tech solutions, right? Because it creates a better solution and a better environment
at the same time. Yeah, a better environment, a better society at the same time. And I love what you were talking about, Kendall, of that vulnerability around mistakes even, and the openness of that and the feedback loop that you're generating. There's so many elements within entrepreneurship that are about how do we create a feedback loop that is as efficient as possible? How do we build, measure, and learn so that you don't end up in that situation where you're releasing a product that nobody wants? And as you said, at the same time, you're going to have to make some hard calls in that process at the same time. I am curious, what would you imagine the changes being if even the work processes and or the ethos of open source were to become more prevalent? Or say a person who's worked in open source as a way of demonstrating their own technical chops, and they're going into a career mode, and what does that look like? What do they bring with them from that open source work? Or what could a company even build with that open source ethos and or processes that you're developing right here with VERSO and others?
So the podcast is 6 hours. Am I right? I just want to just clear. There's so much inside of that. I think there are a couple interesting points to that. So there is the aspect, like company-wise, if you start thinking about what open source means, it's an aspect of humility about what we think we know. And having worked in tech places and having, God knows I follow tech podcasts, like I find technology fascinating. I work in art too, and I love technology in that space, and also am terrified of it in different ways. Like the way we approach that needs more humility when we start thinking about these problems. When it comes to how we think about it affects people coming into the workforce that have done openness, the students that I work with started creating an open source student club, because they're like, we think we need to do this. And I think what ends up happening is an aspect of service, because like doing open source is service to others without a clear, obvious return. There are returns in different ways, but it's not like here's a concrete, like this is the thing. And I think what I hope to bring to that space as the students go through these experiences is that they understand the concept of service in their life and bring that back to where they are. Like the Vermont Zoning Atlas that we've been building, showing zoning laws, like I hope the students leave and they go back to their home states, because most of them are not from here, and they'll go, how do I do this here? We have these same problems. How do we do this here? And build a generation of people that are engaged in service and leading those changes, because someone's got to do it. And you have to have people that are willing to step up. And that's innovation, that's leadership, that's all those spaces that entrepreneurship is also part of.
Yeah. It strikes me that we can create better human outcomes with powerful technologies like artificial intelligence by looking at some of the data experiments being done in your open source world, right? If we understand in the first place that one of the best ways to use a technology like AI is to create bionic workers, take the mundane data collection, data aggregation away from the humans, so that the humans can more rapidly collect whatever kind of data they need to make good and beneficial decisions for humans, right? Like improving that and focusing on it also, so that our focus becomes, all the bandwidth going into a technology like that becomes something that's a force for good. If we focus on the good, I know that sounds almost infantile, but if we focus on the good, we get good outcomes. If the initial conversation before we take it into a digital space is this tool can be a force for bad, and we focus on discussing that, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in essence, right? I mean, you're always going to have bad actors, but we don't emphasize the bad actors. We're going to focus on moving forward and forging ahead with things that can be a force for good.
I think it's kind of this aspect of, we build a lot of our economy around making products, things. And I think it's useful to think about this as how we build people and how we make stuff, not what we make, but how we make it. And those choices about how we do that impacts the final product in infinitely more ways than just be like, how do I make this one thing really quick? And I think I'd love to have AI take away more of my work that I don't want to do, but we also have to make sure that doesn't get filled up with everything else that they're like, well, now you can do 2 times as much work. And that's a cultural choice that I think is literally this morning, I'm just like, oh my God, like there's too much to do. Like, why do we do this to ourselves? Like, we have to make a cultural choice about where do we give space to be human? Because if we don't give space to be human, then we don't make human choices. We don't even make humanity go better. It's thinking about those aspects is a cultural thing I have to think about in this too. Not that open source does that amazingly well either. That's a hard problem that is beyond just a method of being open or not. But that's something I think we keep hitting against, and we have to make different choices around it.
You're reminding us that all these things are just tools. It's the decisions we make that count, right?
Yeah.
And how we use those tools.
So I keep hearing participation, right? That's been a theme in a lot of different areas. But, when I look at lots of different technology uptake, I joke to my teenage kids, did you prompt today? Did you read your book before bed? Did you do some reading? And did you prompt today? And did you ask your teacher something about AI, right? It's just engagement. I don't care if they're asking something silly. You can prompt, what would you do if, I don't care. Just exercise the practice to get that feedback loop starting so that the brain juices start going, right? And so my question to you is, one on in terms of in the 2.5 years you've seen this, can you tell us what you see as far as uptake, as far as trends of awareness of open source, of engagement and interest of open source from your students, and more broadly, um, you know, oftentimes technologists feel like this doesn't happen fast enough. And I have that feeling myself, but I also try to remind myself and use the language of, we need to allow everybody the space to learn and engage in their time and space. And it's up to us, fancy technologists to sort of understand how to bridge the time gap in the process of, building interesting things, building good things that are helpful, frankly, making some mistakes and unbuilding some things that we shouldn't have built, And so I'm curious that from the student level, what kind of trend you're seeing, and more broadly, what kind of perspective you might be getting from your role there in this learning process and engagement process, participation process that we're all striving for.
Starting this job, I've been ecstatic by how many people are ecstatic about it. Like they enjoy it. They're like, oh yeah, no, I get it. It may be hard for them to do it, to have time to make things happen. And also they understand and they feel the things that this is trying to solve. And it is like building community, like doing events, bringing people together. I've been part of the event community in Burlington for a while in different forms and trying to grow those spaces. Like the people that go into that, like, oh yeah, like we need the community. We've all been kind of alone for a while. Like we need to actually grow that human connection because we know we need that. And that's interesting to see that evolving. I think students look at a lot of this and they are, I don't know, as an adult, I feel powerless in the face of some of the problems that we face. And I think all of us are trying to find ways to do meaningful work because we know we've all done meaningless work and we're like, this isn't really fulfilling. And like, great, money is nice, but like, damn, we have things we actually have to deal with here. And I think the students really directly see it because they see their future in front of them. They're like, we actually need to do things better, and they will engage in that and they're going to put the effort in. And I think more and more of the adult population too is in the same place where like just getting a good salary and like cool lunches at work, like isn't enough. And we're pushing all of those boundaries and being like, no, like we actually have to make the world substantially better, not just I can get a car in 5 minutes, like genuinely change the paradigm because we can see the paradigm not working well for all of us. So I think like the incentives are aligned and it's kind of like helping people navigate the way. That you're right, it's not fast because this isn't, think of like ants in a colony, right? Like this is not direct, like, hey, I'm telling you what to do. People have to figure this out and it's not a fast process. It is more resilient over time because we all have the same clear mission in our brains that we're trying to achieve the same kind of thing, but it is definitely not fast. I think if you try to rush it, it can make it go badly. It can make people feel forced, and then we have this place where it can end up in very complicated ways. Like I think the nature of science being as distrusted as it is now, like there's aspects of how we think about community building that needs to be thought about when we think about science because, yeah, like people don't believe direct scientific thoughts, like obvious data, like. How do we change that? It's not by telling them it's right. It's involving them in the community and having them engage with that. And that is not fast, but I think it has to happen. I have to think about that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that for sure. And specifically in UVM medical environment, one of the things that I do see as potentially the faster pathway to this learning is, doctors, nurses, all the practitioners in medical, they're out there doing something because they're on a mission personally most of the time, but also stuck in that grind that you described, getting stressed a little bit thin. And they also are acutely aware of the challenges that not having openness creates, right? Every, patient that has a record somewhere else, different doctors trying to share information to get better results. So I'm really curious. I'm actually speaking a little about governance and regulation in Vermont and different ways to think about companies considering working in Vermont around this area. And so I'm really curious how your office and how UVM is really facilitating the medical and med tech side of this in terms of open data, especially. I think again that's where we have the potential to make the fastest movement, because frankly, there's a huge, need for it. There's a direct public benefit when we start, leveraging this health data. And you're right in the middle of a great ecosystem with UVM Medical that's always been, frankly, in my opinion, pretty progressive in how they do things in terms of compared to other hospital systems in the country. So, yeah, really curious where you see that maybe going closer to home and maybe hitting some exciting milestones in the near future.
I think part of that is there's different medical data that's shared that can be public shared. A lot of it is harder to publicly share, and there are obviously liability risks of sharing that. So like some of the stuff will never be public engagement. You may have data sharing agreements between different institutions to work on research and for things, right? Like that's open-ish in the sense that like there are people outside of just themselves that get to see it. And there's elements of like what is useful to share inside of the medical data space. Like I'm working on building data infrastructure for sharing data, but the interesting question is like, what are the administrative policies we need to like share that? What are the constraints we need to address? What are the concerns we have to have? And then how do we think about ownership of that data? How do we think about how we share that data with other people and that ownership piece? I think like for me, some of the things that I'm exploring, like we have one of the pods of students is working on a medical algorithm piece that they're trying to figure out how to make this and turn this into a way that can be tested outside of UVM to see if it's working the way that we hope that it's going to work. And I'm also exploring how we share, like, so there's something in tech that's called GitHub. That's the way you distribute. GitHub and GitLab both help you distribute code and do version control. And I'm kind of exploring how we think about that for distributing medical programs, not like software, but like actual full programs. How we think about collectively collaborating and building these programs that are often, I don't know, stored on someone's computer somewhere. Like those things are not shared easily, and trying to find ways to facilitate that collaboration, exposure, and iteration process at a higher rate than it currently is. Like I think those are places where it's hard to do that. And there was things that we can know from other industries that we can just be like, hey, just let's do this. Make it a little bit easier for you to use it in the way that you would understand because you're not a programmer. But there are ways to make this better that's already been done and tested in 1,000 other fields that we can just bring into that space. And I think there's totally game for that. I think there's a lot of opportunity inside of the medical college, the medical library, because there's like kind of two libraries and systems for the medical and the regular university. Like they are deeply interested in open science, and we're trying to find ways to make that more and more possible. I think the reality is that doesn't go to a single repository. It goes to a lot of different places. And the question is, how do you build a catalog of that? Like how do you think about that distributed network system, and how do you understand what's out there and then make that searchable? Like, hey, I'm interested in this. So I was talking to the dean of the library yesterday about this. Like, this is a hard problem and one that we need to understand to answer your question. Because I imagine a lot of this is out there, just no one can find it.
Yep.
How do we think about finding
it truly openly accessible to the world and not have someone with their finger on it and, drive?
Well, are you special enough? Right. Yes.
Excellent.
So, gents, I know that we're coming up to the end of our time, and something that I've always appreciated about our podcast is when we're able to leave our listeners with something that they can take into their day-to-day lives or even to engage with. So I would put the question to Kendall, is there a way that our listeners could either engage with some aspect of open source or learn more about it, or an idea that you'd like people to carry into their day and maybe think about as they're going about their day-to-day?
I got to kind of wax a little bit philosophical. I think it's an element of thinking about how you collaborate with others and share the benefits and information back and forth. Because practicing that process of doing that well makes all the other things, like it feeds into your personal life, even if it's not open. And when you get to the open space, you're like, oh yeah, like I can do this well. And it's not a skill that we often practice in the same way. Like being deliberate about that helps us get better at those kinds of things.
Very awesome. Well, I'm going to throw out a little plug because I have a little side project in open that I have not cultivated fully, but I took over a meetup group in Vermont called Open Innovation and Entrepreneurship that has several hundred people in it. And I've always been kind of looking for a partner in promoting that. So I'm putting this out to the listeners. If there's someone that, wants to partner up, I keep paying for the meetup and keeping that, service going, and, build on that open innovation entrepreneurship group as a community. I would be very happy to add an admin to that. And I think, Kendall, you might already be in that group from years ago. I know you and I probably met like 2017, and then I've sort of just seen you in passing along the years. But I definitely think that, Vermont's a great place for this, right? I think there's a strong ethos in general here. And it's not that we have to like cookie cutter that everywhere else. It's about part of that ethos is personalization and localization. And I think that's the power that we can try to promote in other communities and for other individuals is personalization and localization. And that's what technology needs to be human, in my opinion. So really, really appreciate your work and being here with us today. And do hope that folks, seek you out, maybe, apply to attend UVM just to get into those programs. And are there any other ways that like industry or other, just curious professionals might engage directly with VERSO?
I mean, Will keeps sending me emails, so I mean, there is.
Yeah, so find Will. So everybody out there, just find Will, and then
It's a pipeline.
It's a pipeline. I mean, we have open GitHub. You can find our work out there as VERSO-UVM. We have a website that's VERSO. You can just search for VERSO, you'll find us. And there's parts of this like collaborations with industry partners would be great, and finding ways that make sense for all of us is kind of the design question that Will and I keep going through, which is fascinating.
Awesome. And we'll have links to the VERSO program at UVM on our episode page. It has been a pleasure, Will and Ryan, to once again co-host with you for the Innova802 series. And it has been an absolute pleasure having you, Kendall Fortney, on the show. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Phil, thank you so much. And I know we'll be talking again soon.
SMG's Are We Here Yet podcast is a production of M the Media Project and SM Graves Associates. Learn more at smgravesassociates.com.